With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet NewsHour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thanks for tuning in once again to the AgNet NewsHour. Joining me once again, Lorrie as co-host. Welcome back, Lorrie.
Thank you so much.
And, you and I were talking a little bit off mic about a hot topic going on right now with the Corporate Transparency Act. And I want to just jump right into this because there's a lot going on with this act, and there's a lot to talk about here. And top of mind, of course, there was a ruling that came down last week from a judge in Texas who ruled that the Corporate Transparency Act, he issued a preliminary injunction against it, which would halt its implementation nationwide. Now, this is from a federal court in Texas. The Corporate Transparency Act, there's a lot to this. And it started as part of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, but it covers a much broader area than that.
It does. And just to fill in here just a little bit on what you mentioned, the court decided this was unconstitutional, basically. The judgment was based on the argument that Congress does not have the power to ask for the personal information is in there. And I'm sure we'll get into that in just a moment. But this is just one of a handful of cases that have been filed in federal court. And as you mentioned, right now it is temporary. I think that a lot of people will want to see this becoming a permanent thing. It gets a little cloudy for me on exactly what that means. But I mean, as far as what that means, making it permanent, because from what I understand, Sabrina, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you've seen something else, that it is actually pending another similar case. This judge wants to see what happens with that other pending case that has to do with personal information being released to Congress before they make a final decision on whether or not to make this permanent. And if this becomes permanent, then those other cases that I just mentioned will be dropped.
Right. So that's what I understand too, which I don't know, is that kind of passing the buck almost? One judge waiting for another judge to decide how this case is going to go. But the key thoughts here for farmers, especially, and one of the reasons why farm organizations like the American Farm Bureau and National Cattlemen Beef Association, they are unhappy with the Corporate Transparency Act. They are happy with the injunction to stop it, and this is because, for one thing, the CTA, Corporate Transparency Act, requires ownership disclosure for certain companies. So if you have an LLC, you have to report to the federal government who the individual owners are, whoever controls at least 25% of the company. You have to give over all of their name, their address, all of their pertinent information to the federal government. So, for example, let's say that you and your siblings co-own a farm that is structured as an LLC. If each sibling owns an equal share, like 33% or 25% or whatever, all of you qualify as beneficial owners. And then you must report all of your information to the federal government. Details like your full names, addresses, date of birth, ID numbers even must be given over to the federal government as being, beneficial owners of this company. And I have a few thoughts on that, but I want to hear yours first, Lorrie.
Well, as you mentioned, to get us started, I understand the reasoning behind the whole CTA, and that was just to prevent laundering and to prevent some injustice things that were going on. It's hard because with this day and age and technology, we have a lot of safeguards, but yet things get hacked left and right all the time. It feels like we're always getting a notice or seeing something in the news about something getting hacked. So then it makes me think, I don't know, is this really a good idea or not? This information that would be into the CTA, I'm guessing a lot of this information is already out there in one form or another.
Right.
But from what I understand in doing some interviews on this too, is that not only does it have to do with personal and private information, but also the fact that it takes a lot of time for these companies. They almost have to dedicate someone to do this and stay on top of it. And the good thing is it's only once a year, but they have to stay on top of it. Any changes that are made within that company, within that LLC, have to then be reported. And I also understand from these interviews, it takes quite a while to get this done. And it's sneaking right up because that original deadline was January 1st. So there was kind of a, a hectic side to an urgent side to get this done. That is now being stalled out because of this case.
Right. And and as I said, I can see a couple of sides here. From one angle here, as a consumer, let's say, or as somebody who wants to do business with these other companies, I do kind of want to know who's involved with these companies. I do want that transparency to be able to know, on a certain level who's involved. I don't need to know who's the owner of every farm I visit, but when it comes to some larger companies, yeah, I kind of do want to know who's involved and who's making the money that I give them. But then on a smaller level or on a different level, and especially as a business owner myself, I think I don't want the federal government to have every detail of my business. Should we have to be that detailed in reporting to the federal government? And, I have issues with that, frankly.
Yeah. And one of the cattle producers I talked to, he said the government knows enough. They don't need to know anymore. And technically, a lot of this information, it would be filed. If someone sat down and wanted to piece it all together and
Right.
go through the internet, they could probably find it anyway.
Right. Right. Well, and that's exactly the thing too. As I said, I'm a business owner. My husband and I, we do own an LLC. It's not ag related. We're book publishers, and our business is an LLC. And when we filed that LLC, we had to have all this information on there anyway. And so now we have to file yearly, paperwork to again give the federal government again all of that information that they already have. That's really redundant and frankly, a waste of my time.
Very redundant. And you can't just copy and paste. There's a lot of detailed information that goes into this. I don't know all the details in my interviews. I haven't gotten that far in, but in some of the interviews with the organizations it takes a long time to put this thing together.
Yeah, it does. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to keep talking about this when we come back from the break, and we have reactions from a couple of ag groups too. This is the AgNet NewsHour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She is Lorrie Boyer, and we will be right back. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant. And so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen and reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet NewsHour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
We were talking about the Corporate Transparency Act, and I wanted to read some statements from some ag groups about the ruling that came last week from Texas that was an injunction on the act. So basically, it's putting a pause on the paperwork that farm businesses and other businesses would have been required to file by January 1st. And so this is from the American Farm Bureau Federation president, Zippy Duvall, who said that farmers and ranchers across the country have faced great uncertainty since the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act in early 2021. And as the beneficial ownership information regulations have been written, questions are swirling about who is required to file and who will have access to the confidential data being collected. He says that Farm Bureau has long fought against the mandated disclosures of farmers' private businesses information to the federal government in a number of different scenarios. For a second time this year, a federal court has ruled the CTA oversteps the Constitution on that front. He says, "We appreciate the temporary reprieve provided by the injunction and hope Congress can take a cue from the courts in the coming weeks to provide a more permanent resolution to this problematic policy." That again from American Farm Bureau Federation President Zippy Duvall commenting on the Corporate Transparency Act.
I also have a statement, this from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They pretty much are echoing what Duvall is saying there, but they are also the ones that were talking about how this actually is pending. This case is pending on the other one. This is what I was looking for when I was talking about this. This case is pending the case called, I'm going to try not, this is like a tongue twister, Texas Top Cop Shop Incorporated versus Garland. Same type of case. I don't know the details of that case. I just know that that's what it's called. It was also in Texas, and for the time being, the injunction prevents them from enforcing the act and delays the deadline based on this case. I hope that made sense. And so I'm guessing that I'm guessing the reason a court kind of is waiting to see this is because if they made a decision right now and it's different than this decision, boy, that could be a lot of confusion going on right there.
It really could. If they contradict each other, if the rulings contradict each other, it could cause a lot of confusion around the state. And so that would be one reason why one judge would wait and see what the other judge, the other judge rules on that case. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this and see how all of this plays out.
Yeah. And, I guess the bottom line that I'm asking along with almost everyone else, and we are specifically talking about agriculture, but this applies, as you mentioned, to some non-agriculture LLCs, well, all non-agriculture LLCs, is this constitutional?
Right.
Or is this an infringement of private and personal property rights?
Right. And that is such an interesting question when we're talking about businesses, because how much does the public have a right to know about private businesses? And I think that that is such an interesting question.
You think about the medical industry, and we have those forms we fill out called HIPAA forms that protects our medical private information from going out there. Isn't this kind of the same thing?
Right. I mean, should you be able to start a business or to run a business with some privacy protections?
Yes.
And, again, as a business owner, I want to say yes. I don't want to have my information out there for everybody. But then again, I can see this from either a consumer side or a business to business partnership kind of way. You want to know who is actually getting your money. Who are you actually doing business with? And I wonder also if some of this comes into play there, especially, um, there's been such a focus on finding out who is actually owning different corporations, and is it other countries that have a say or have a hand in American companies as well? And we do need to know that information too. So what is that balance?
That is a good point. What I'm not sure of there, and I'm not sure you can fact check me, I guess, because I'm not sure where I'm getting this from, but I thought if another company was operating in the United States, they also had to file some sort of paperwork or some sort of disclosure stuff to be able to operate here.
Right. If it's majority owned or something like
Have
that
you heard
too.
of that?
Yes.
Okay.
But again, we're not the
Yeah.
experts here. And anybody
No.
getting business advice from us, please talk to your business lawyers.
We should have started with our own disclosure, our own Transparency Act. No, we are the deliverers of information.
Right.
But we also really get involved in this when we do interviews and have discussions at the local grocery store about these issues. So I think we're fine talking about it. But yeah, I'm not a lawyer or
Yeah,
doctor or anything like that. So I just know what our experts tell us, right?
exactly. And that is our sole responsibility here is to deliver to our listeners what our experts tell us. And with that, we are going to take another commercial break. Lorrie will be back right after this commercial break. This is the AgNet NewsHour. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet NewsHour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
Today, I am talking with Isaiah Kisika, who is with the University of California, Davis. He works in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department, specializing in land, air, and water resources. Isaiah, today we will talk about your work and research in groundwater nitrates in the state of California. But first off, tell us more about yourself and your background.
I'm a professor here at the University of California, Davis, and my research, teaching, and extension work focuses on water management in agricultural systems. I help growers use water more efficiently and try to minimize the impact on the environment. That could be groundwater, it could be soil salinization, or any other impacts from irrigated agriculture.
On the groundwater nitrate, is this an actual study that you have been engaged in for a while?
Yes, we've been doing this work. It's actually part of a larger effort, a national effort by the USDA SIP project, where they have monitoring of water quality in what they classify as important or critical watersheds. And our work is responsible for the Central Valley Aquifer System. And we started this work that we just recently published in 2020. That's when the sensors were installed and the monitoring started.
Where at is the work being done? Is it focused on a certain part of the state or is on the whole state?
It is focused on the Central Valley Aquifer System. And we started our work near Esparto in the Sacramento Valley, and we moved on to Modesto. We have a site in Almonds near Modesto and another site in Citrus near Fresno in Orange Cove.
So how is the study actually being conducted? Are you using technology or going and just doing some old-fashioned digging? How does that look?
We're actually using fairly cutting-edge technology, and that's what makes it exciting. And we are comparing that cutting-edge technology to traditional methods and to see how well they agree. So we evaluated 3 methods. One of them is actually what the state of California uses in their regulation of nitrate to groundwater, which is the field scale mass balance. It's sort of like a checkbook. You track all the nitrogen that was applied minus what was removed through crop yield, and what remains is potentially what would be mobilized to groundwater. And then the second method is what has been traditionally used, where you make or you drill groundwater observation wells, and then you go to the well and then pull a sample from the well and test the water quality. The challenge with that method is you see the problem after the fact. The new method we are using, which is called a VEDOS zone monitoring system, is basically you put sensors all the way from the root zone to the groundwater table. And in the site that we recently published, that depth was about 35 feet. And so that allowed us to see the nitrate as it migrated with depth.
How is the nitrate migrating then?
So as you know, nitrate is very mobile because it's very soluble in water. And what was really interesting in our study, we know that nitrate is going to leach. But the conventional wisdom has been that it takes weeks to months to years before you see it in the groundwater. But because of the technology we were able to use, we're able to notice that it actually can reach there in as short as 10 days if you have these very strong atmospheric rivers following very drought years.
How are groundwater managers using the data that you have created at this point?
So I think there are two audiences that this research may inform. One are the growers, and then two are the policymakers or the water managers, the water quality coalitions, especially in the Central Valley. For the growers, I think in this era where we are living in climate extremes, because when you have a drought, crops don't grow well, so they don't use the nitrogen as efficiently. So a lot of it gets left in the root zone. And if you follow that with a very wet winter, then there's a high risk of that nitrate moving. So the trick is to try and end the growing season with as little, we call it residual nitrate, as possible. And the way to do that is use advanced techniques like high frequency fertigation, for example. Instead of putting all your nitrogen on as a pre-plant, put on small amounts that are adaptive to what the weather conditions are in the growing season or what your yield potential is going to be. That is hard. It's easier said than done. And one of the things we are working on is to actually develop sensors that measure soil nitrate in real time in the soil, instead of pulling a soil sample and sending it to the lab, which has a lag time, but developing tools that farmers could actually use to make their management easier. The other audience are the water quality boards, or the state water board that's actually responsible for this. The state has adopted a model called the soil and water assessment tool to assess best management practices and if they are protective of groundwater. But one of the questions that has come up is the accuracy of the model and the validation of the model. So some of the data that we are collecting is being used to improve and validate the model that's used for regulation.
Is there certain agricultural fertilizers or chemicals that have more nitrates that are being used than others?
No, most farmers fairly use the same type of fertilizer crossing systems, usually associated with cost. Okay. A lot of them use UAN 32 because it's effective. It's expensive, but it's not as expensive as, say, slow release fertilizers.
I'm talking here today with Isaiah Kisika with the University of California, Davis, working in a biological and agricultural engineering department where he specializes in land, air, and water resources. And we'll be right back here on the Ag News Hour.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant. And so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen and reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back as I continue my conversation here today with Isaiah Kisika with the University of California, Davis. He specializes in land, air, and water resources in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department. Our conversation is focusing on his work and research with regard to groundwater nitrates. What kinds of crops are you focusing your groundwater nitrate study on?
In field cropping system, basically processing tomato cropping system. So that's where we have most data. We just recently installed systems in almonds and citrus. So I think those results will be forthcoming. But in any farming system, I think if the management is such that you end up with a lot of unused nitrate at the end of the season, you're going to have leaching. I think the key in any cropping system is to manage your nitrate or fertilizers in an adaptive way based on your yield potential. And for example, we say that every crop has what is called a nitrogen removal coefficient, and CDFA publishes all these numbers for the different crops. For processing tomatoes, for example, you remove about 3 pounds per ton of fresh weight. So, and the average yield in California is about 50 tons. But if we have a drought and you have a lot of heat waves, you have a lot of stress, and you only get 30 tons instead of 50. So there's a potentially, if you apply the same fertilizer, there's a potentially a lot of fertilizer that is not going to be removed by the crop and will remain in the soil and will eventually be moved in the environment.
Okay. And what happens? Does it kill the plants, or does it provide less yields? Like, what happens when there's too many nitrates?
The plant will only use up to what it needs, okay? And because nitrate is very mobile, when you have water, it's just going to be washed below the root zone.
But then what is the negative about that?
The negative about that is basically just ends up in drinking water sources like groundwater.
I see. Okay.
And
which is harmful.
Which is harmful to certain parts of the population.
Got it. Okay. All right. Did you collaborate with anyone else?
The other issue with that is fertilizers are expensive. You really don't want to be flushing money below your root zone.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you collaborating with water districts or municipalities or anyone else on this?
Yeah, we're working closely with the Southern Sun Working Water Coalition. And these are coalitions, you probably are familiar with them. They're helping growers implement best management practices such that they remain compliant with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program is the one that regulates nitrate leaching into groundwater and surface water.
Okay. Anything else to mention here today that I haven't asked about this?
Yeah, I think to me, the biggest takeaway is managing farming is generally going to be more challenging in this era of climate extremes. And any help that growers can get to make their management easier is beneficial to the growers, but also to the broader society.
All right, that makes sense. Okay. All right. Well, Isaiah, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for visiting with me about this.
So, Lorrie, do you have all the answers you need? Sometimes I feel like as scientists, sometimes we ramble on things, but
Well, you didn't ramble. Usually people actually elaborate more than you did. So no, you didn't ramble at all.
Yeah, if you look at our papers, what was really interesting is you see that when the rains came, you see in the wells, the nitrate shoots beyond because the drinking water limit is 10 parts per million or 10 grams per liter. But then you see when the rains come after the heavy rains we had in the winter of 22-23, you saw the nitrate in the wells shoot up in a very short time. The site we worked in here in the Sacramento Valley, as you know, we have relatively heavier soils than as compared to farther south, but we still were able to see that. So I suspect if you even had a sandier soil, the risk would be higher.
I want to thank my guest for joining me here on the show today, Isaiah Kasika. He is in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department, specializing in land, air, and water resources at the University of California, Davis. I'm Lorrie Boyer, and we are back with Sabrina Halvorson right after this.
Welcome back to the AgNet NewsHour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
For this segment, we're going back to the discussion on raw milk and avian influenza. The USDA on Friday issued a new federal order and accompanying guidance that requires raw milk samples nationwide to be collected and shared with USDA for testing. The new guidance from USDA, which was developed with significant input from state, veterinary, and public health stakeholders, will facilitate comprehensive H5N1 surveillance of the nation's milk supply and dairy herds. This did come after avian influenza was found in raw milk samples here in California. So joining us for this segment is an expert on this issue. She is Dr. Meg Schaeffer, an epidemiologist and the National Public Health Advisor for the SAS or SAS Institute. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Schaefer. We wanted to talk about avian influenza and raw milk. Now, this is something that my co-host, Lorrie Boyer, and I had talked about on the air a couple of days ago with the avian influenza, the virus being found in some raw milk samples in California. And I really liked the idea of having you come in as an expert to talk more about this because it is such an important issue, especially as we're hearing more and more people who are turning to raw milk. And consuming more of that. And there's a significant health risk there. But I need this to come from an expert, not just a radio person, which is what I am. So if we could start out with, if you wouldn't mind, please tell us a little bit about, first off, if this is a real threat or a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Avian influenza, in and of itself, is a virus of great concern. It first emerged in 1996 in the form of a highly pathogenic version that we have never seen before in the history of influenza. And we know a great deal about this virus. Why this virus is so significant to the agricultural community is the fact that it affects chickens, turkeys, all types of domestic poultry, and therefore all of their outputs. And now is affecting dairy cattle, could easily spread to beef cattle and other livestock. So in terms of the threat it provides to agriculture, yes, this is absolutely significant and serious. And as those products go into our food market, there is a risk of exposure to humans. Now, right now, the outbreak has been focused on agricultural workers and trying to make sure that our food supply remains safe and that our producers are part of those decisions that help ensure that our food supply remains safe. But the reason why this is such a concern to people is that we have no immunity to it. So, yes, we all know there's seasonal flu strains that circulate, but influenza, the virus, is remarkably mutagenic. So it changes itself as it infects people, pigs, birds, and pretty much just about any other species you can imagine. There's been influenza even found in bats and harbor seals and alpacas. So, what flu does is it changes itself, it acquires different fragments of virus potentially from other flu types. And our bodies, or human bodies, we recognize human flu, and our bodies know how to fight that. But when the flu virus presents itself as an avian influenza virus or a swine influenza virus, our bodies, even vaccinated bodies, don't know what to do with that virus. And it can cause very significant systemic illness. It can cause secondary infections or lead to secondary infections like pneumonia. The frightening part about influenza is that it can attack otherwise healthy people. So, children, middle aged people with no comorbidities, and it can act very fast and spread rapidly. So, this pales in comparison to the potential effects of what we saw with COVID in terms of affecting morbidity and mortality.
So, when we have seen cases of the avian influenza in humans from dairy, that has been dairy workers, people actually coming into contact with the cows. This has not been from people drinking milk. Is that right?
Right. But if we could break this apart a little bit and say about half of the human cases we've seen this year have come from poultry exposure. So it is, yes, cattle exposure and poultry, but we now have 4 cases across the US where there's no known exposure to livestock or birds. And that's very concerning because we're not sure if they could have acquired it from something consumed or if there could be person to person transmission that we're not detecting. Now, as far as the issue of consumption of raw milk, what we have and what we know is largely hypothetical because we can't test whether or not someone acquires flu through drinking raw milk, raw infected milk. But what we know about the virus tells us that infected food products, so chicken that is infected that has not been thoroughly cleaned, or chicken parts that have been consumed in Asia that contain this virus, have caused infections. We also, in people, we also have evidence from research studies that show that when you infect through the gastrointestinal system in animals, that there can be systemic illness. So we know that the pathway to infection is absolutely possible with raw milk, but we don't yet know to the extent that it would happen.
We're talking this morning with epidemiologist Dr. Meg Schaeffer, and we will continue this conversation right after this quick break. This is the AgNet NewsHour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be right back.
Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Welcome back to the AgNet NewsHour. We are joined this morning by epidemiologist and National Public Health Advisor for the SAS Institute, Dr. Meg Schaeffer. So when we're looking at raw milk, then from what I understand, again, I am just a radio host. You are the expert. So please, anytime I'm wrong, please correct me. But from what I understand is that the pasteurization process does remove a lot of other things that are in raw milk or could be in raw milk that can make us very sick. So is there the same success with pasteurization at removing avian influenza from raw milk?
Absolutely. You know, there's a reason that we started pasteurization decades ago. It does not affect the nutrient value of milk. It does not reduce any of the things that we get from milk, which are frankly kind of minimal in terms of vitamins and minerals. But what it does is provide an exceptional amount of protection to our bodies. If you're a pregnant woman, you are at high risk for suffering miscarriage if you acquire listeria from raw milk. You can also get Campylobacter or E. coli, which in young children can result in hemolytic uremic syndrome and can be fatal. It can result in salmonellosis. So there are pathogens that cows have and are naturally exposed to that they have immunity to. But when those bacteria and potentially viruses are passed on to people, we cannot fight them. So the risk of acquiring a gastrointestinal illness is frankly much higher than avian influenza. And unless there's extensive screening performed with raw milk, which can't always capture everything, pasteurization, just like cooking ground beef or cooking your steak, is the way to go.
You made a point, and I wanted to talk more about it if it's okay.
Yeah.
That pasteurization does not remove nutrients from milk. And when I was researching before my previous reports on the raw milk situation, um, there's seems to be a belief out there that pasteurization does remove nutrients, or it makes the milk, um, it makes it more. You can more easily be allergic to it. I'm sorry, I can't think of the terminology, but is any of that factual, or is that just kind of stuff that's been spread online that again is not true?
I think it's quite frankly a lot of pseudoscience. When you're trying to figure out if something is truly factual in epidemiology, we use this approach called Hill's postulates. And one of the components of that is when you study a topic and you obtain results, other people who are separate researchers from yourself should be able to replicate those results. And that's been the problem with some of the raw milk findings that have been produced and published on the web is they're isolated instances and they probably did not follow appropriate clinical research protocol of which we have in academic institutions in places like SAS all over the world. So when we study that topic, even if you think about it logically, pasteurization as a process has become incredibly efficient. It's a flash process, it's very short, but it kills everything that could potentially harm a person. But you can't denature a vitamin, you can't kill calcium. Those things will remain. And in fact, there are typically some additives that are put into raw milk products, like probiotics, for example, that tend to make people think that it is more healthy, but they're additives that are put into the raw product, not things that are naturally found in raw milk by itself.
That is really interesting. I did not know about the additives. And when I was doing that research, one of the things I kept coming back to was a study that was done. And the study was done in 1907. And I can't believe people were still referencing this study from 1907 about pasteurization. I have to believe that our science has advanced since then, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's challenging. I think it's challenging for anyone who hasn't spent a significant amount of time looking at how research studies are put together. And I don't envy that position. But I think we have to go back to the scientific community at large really looks to those tenets of is it repeatable? Can other people produce the same findings? Are they using scientific rigor? We question each other, we comment on each other's research publications. These things aren't done in isolation. And sometimes science gets it wrong. But where raw milk is concerned, the research is definitive. There is no health benefit. And there's a significant amount of potential detriment in terms of the diseases you can acquire.
So, for our listeners who are not part of the agricultural audience, they're just part of the consumer audience, what is the key thing that you would want them to know?
I think the safest thing right now is just to take a pause. If you're a huge raw milk advocate and you really believe fiercely in its value in your life, take a pause. Take a pause until the USDA and FDA can get the current outbreak under control. And then maybe we can come up with new testing strategies and approaches to make that product safe and accessible again. But right now, the risk is far too high to expose your children to expose any person, especially someone who might be immune compromised or pregnant women. That's a really significant risk. So take a pause and think about it in terms of how you think of, eating cookie batter or cookie dough. You think about, at least I think a lot of people do, the fact that raw eggs, about 25% of them contain salmonellosis. So I think people think twice before trying cookie batter or cookie dough, and that's kind of a logical thing. Maybe some of us sneak it in here and there, but with something like raw milk, it's not going to even take more than a taste to potentially get an exposure. So we cook eggs, we try to avoid exposure to that. We cook our chicken, we cook our meat, and we cook it in a way where we know that it's going to be safe for us to consume. And right now, raw milk is not safe for us to consume, and it's not going to be for many, many months, if not years.
And then for our agricultural audience, the ones who are the dairy farmers and,
Mhm.
other producers, what would you want them to know about just the whole outbreak of avian influenza?
That I absolutely empathize with the amount of work that this is bringing onto your plates. This is a virus that's difficult to get under control. It's difficult to understand. But the outbreak is so widespread in our dairy cattle right now that we have got to be aggressive in trying to stop it. And in fact, I know the USDA today released new testing guidelines requiring the testing of raw milk, even raw milk that's sitting pre-pasteurization, and requiring the sharing of more information for contact tracing and epidemiologic analysis. Those actions are really critical, and they're really critical to dampen this down, to stop livestock loss, to stop the spread of illness, to stop agricultural workers from getting sick. And, at the end of the day, I would think as a producer, you would not want to be the farm that starts or originates the virus that ends up becoming a pandemic. And that possibility is real. And all of our producers have the power and the ability to help work together with our government agencies and officials to stop this.
I want to thank you so much for your time. I know that you have a lot going on, and I really appreciate you coming on and, helping our listeners navigate some of these things that are going on that can really dramatically affect them.
Sure, absolutely, anytime.
That is our show for today. This is the AgNet NewsHour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet NewsHour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.